When upon life's billows you are tempest-tossed, when you are discouraged, thinking all is lost, count your many blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God hath done. Are you ever burdened with the load of care? Does the cross seem heavy you are called to bear? Count your many blessings, every doubt will fly, and you will be singing as the days go by. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God hath done. When you look to others with their lands and gold, think that Christ has promised you his wealth untold. Count your many blessings money cannot buy, your reward in heaven nor your home on high. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God hath done. So amid the conflict, whether great or small, do not be discouraged, God is over all. Count your many blessings, angels will attend, help and comfort give you to your journey's end. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your many blessings, see what God hath done.
Blue skies and rainbows and sunbeams from heaven are what I can see. When my Lord is living in me, I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never would part. Tall mountains, green valleys, the beauty that surrounds me, all makes me aware of the one who made it all. I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never would part. Green grass and flowers, the blooming in springtime, all works of the Master I live for each day. I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never would part. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus, for it is the power that saves us today. I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never
today. Whiter than snow, Lord, wash me just now, as in thine presence humbly I bow. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Hold o'er my being absolute sway. Fill with thy spirit till all shall see Christ only always living in me.
If the skies above you are gray, you are feeling so blue. If your cares and burdens seem great all the whole day through, there's a silver lining that shines in the heavenly land. Look by faith and see it, my friend. Trust in His promises, friend. Sing and
be happy,
press on to the goal. Trust in Him who leads you. He will keep your soul. Let all be faithful. Look to Him and pray. Lift your voice and praise Him in song. Sing and be happy today. Often we are troubled and tired, sick with sorrow and pain. There are others living in sin, blessed with earthly gain. Take new courage, we cannot tell what tomorrow may bring. When the dark clouds vanish away, then your heart truly can sing. Sing and
be happy,
press along to the goal. Trust in Him who leads you. He will keep your soul. Let all be faithful. Look to Him and pray. Lift your voice and praise Him in song. Sing and be happy today. Oft we fail to see the rainbow up in heaven's fair sky, when it seems the fortunes of earth frown and pass us by. There are things we know that are worth more than silver and gold, if we hope and trust Him each day, we shall have pleasure untold. Sing and be happy, press along to the goal. Trust in Him who leads you. He will keep your soul. Let all be faithful. Look to Him and pray. Lift your voice and praise Him in song.
Testing. All right, good morning, everyone. Okay, we're going to go ahead and continue our study of 1 Peter this morning. In this morning's class, we're looking at chapter 2, verses 11 through 25. Okay, if you'll recall from last week, Peter, as part of his larger discussion on Christian living, discussed or tackled the concept of Christian identity. And that was, what does it mean to be a Christian? In this week's text, as well as in next week, he's going to continue with the idea of Christian living, but he's going to get into the specific topic of behavior as it relates to the surrounding world and behavior in the face of suffering. So if we look at our topics this morning, we'll see that in the first couple of verses, Peter will give an overview of what the expected behavior should be of a Christian. Again, relating to the outside world, how we interface with the world. And then he starts getting into specific behaviors, all regarding submission. Now then he'll take a break here at the end, and we'll talk about what our example is for submission. Okay, so let's go ahead and start our study. We're going to start by looking at verses 11 through 12. It says, "Beloved, I urge you as foreigners and strangers to abstain from fleshly lust, which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God on the day of visitation." All right, so right off the bat, or to start the text, Peter reminded his readers of their heavenly citizenship, or them not belonging to the world. Okay, and so he uses the word strangers here in verse 11. Now that word strangers is the same Greek word that he used in verse 1, as well as its rendering in verse 17 when he says, during the time of your stay on earth. Okay, and by using that word, he goes and essentially does two things. One is something he's been doing the entire lesson, or the entire letter, I should say, and that is he's looking back at the Old Testament to get New Testament ideas across, or Christian ideas across. So he's referring to strangers in a land, all right? So he's looking back at the Israelites and how they were strangers in the land in which they lived. But he's also using that word in the contemporary sense of the time, because when Greeks read that, they saw that as a person who lived in a city but did not have citizenship in that city. So he's very specifically saying, okay, you again are not of this world. You are not citizens of the world. You have a heavenly citizenship. So why is it important for him to stress this before he starts his discussion of expected behavior? Stumped you already, huh? Wow, that was fast. Okay, so so he's about to get into some pretty hard topics. When we start looking at them, these are not easy. These behaviors that he's asking these Christians and us to do, for that matter, are not something that come natural to people, okay? Now, also have to remember that these people are coming from a pagan background. They are Gentile Christians, and they are, again, surrounded by a pagan lifestyle. And he's about to tell them, your behavior is going to have to change. And it's very unnatural in the sense of the world with the behavior he's going to ask of them. So he's having to remind them, remember, you're not of this world. As a result, your behavior does not need to reflect this world. It needs to reflect your heavenly citizenship. All right, so going on from that, when we look, again, I urge you as foreigners and strangers to abstain from fleshly lust. Okay, so he uses the phrase to abstain from fleshly lust. Okay, this is not exclusively sexual behavior. It's really any kind of behavior that's worldly. He's talked about a few of these behaviors already in verse 1. He mentioned deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander. And then we look over at Galatians chapter 5, verses 19 to 21. Paul goes on and provides a rather lengthy list of these behaviors. He calls them deeds of the flesh. Those are sexual immorality, impurity, indecent behavior, idolatry, witchcraft, hostilities, strife, jealousy, outburst of anger, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, and carousing. Now, all these behaviors definitely applied to that time frame, but do they apply nowadays? Yes, they do. Because we don't have any problems at all in the church about factions or dissensions, do we? Right? Okay. So these are behaviors that that Peter is saying you need to get rid of. Now, when you get rid of something, what did Jesus say about that? When you empty something out, what has to happen? You've got to fill it, right? Because something else will come back in and it'll make it worse, essentially, right? So what do we fill it with? Okay, Scripture. Also would be the fruits of the Spirit, right? If you just look a little further in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 to 23, those are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Self-control actually being pretty primary there because most of those behaviors that Paul previously listed can be handled with self-control. Okay. So we want to dump those behaviors, but why do we want to do that? So the comment was they're contrary to God's law. Peter speaks to it. He says that they wage war against the soul. Okay, and Paul speaks to this too in Galatians chapter 5, verse 17. He says, for the desire of the flesh is against the spirit, and that's with a capital S, and the spirit against the flesh, for these are in opposition to one another in order to keep you from doing whatever you want. So what Peter and Paul are saying here is you've got a sort of tug of war going on in your soul between the Holy Spirit and these desires you have as a person, right? And they're constantly going back and forth. And he's saying you got to get rid of these behaviors because they're waging war on your soul. All right, so as we go on in verse 12, Peter intimates that Christians are to be concerned about their behavior as it appears to the surrounding community. So why should Christians be concerned about what their appearance looks like? And I don't mean physical, I mean behavioral. Sorry.
They're supposed to reflect God and Jesus and show the world that because of them, they're different.
Okay. So the comment was, you're supposed to be different. You're supposed to behave as God, or to obey God, to show the world that we're different. Paul talked about this in Colossians chapter 4, verse 5. He says, conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making most of the opportunity. It's essentially what was just said. We are a reflection of God, or our behavior reflects on God. And so that's going to affect any opportunities we have to glorify God or to proclaim Christ. If our behavior is poor, how can we glorify God in that? And then how can we proclaim Christ when people see that? All right, so one thing I kind of want to call to attention is if you look at verse 12, it says, keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles. But if we look in Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, Jesus actually said, take care not to practice your righteousness in the sight of people, to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have a reward with your Father otherwise you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. So the question is how does Peter's statement in verse 12 contrast with Jesus' words in Matthew? Yes?
The example of the rabbi standing on the corner saying, thank God I'm not like this poor wretch. That's waving your righteousness or self-righteousness in front of others.
Okay.
Live the way that you should, but don't run around beating people over the head with the fact that look how much better I am than you are.
Okay. So the comment was we don't want to wave our righteousness around. In other words, we live the way we should, but we don't want to beat people on the head with how much better we are than they are. That was a comment, and it's true. It all comes down to motive or attitude, right? So what Paul's talking about is a God-centric behavior, right? What you do to put the glory on God or just put the spotlight on God. What Jesus was talking about was avoiding selfish or self-centric behavior, right? these people aren't doing these things because they're glorifying God. They're trying to glorify themselves, right? They're making themselves look good for the sake of themselves, right? That's not what Peter or Paul was saying. All right, so let's move on. And if we look again at verse 12, we see that Peter indicated the type of persecution, or at least some of the type of persecution that the Christians were facing in this particular area. He wrote, "In the thing in which they slander you as evildoers," in verse 12. So what we see here is that readers of the letter were facing gossip and false accusations from the surrounding pagan community. Okay, so we get to recall that Christians were already told to not slander in verse 1. So what the direction here is, despite being slandered, Christians are not to slander in kind, so as to remove any hint of truth whatsoever that these accusations being thrown at them, if there's any basis in that, okay? Essentially, their behavior should be beyond reproach, such that any accusation or slander made towards them comes across as nonsense. That's what Paul's saying. Yes?
We just need to be, more intentional, we just need to be so watchful of our behavior, not only not do these things we're told not to, but in addition not beat people over the head with our righteousness. Because there's people out here that they know we're supposed to be Christian, and they're just watching you like a hawk, and they're just waiting for you to do something that's not Christian. And that's their excuse not to be a Christian. You're just a bunch of hypocrites.
Okay. So the comment was made, we just have to watch our behavior all the time, because there's people that look at us and they know what our faith is, and they're looking for an excuse to say, well, you say you're a Christian, but your behavior is this way, so you're nothing more than a hypocrite. Yes?
And the truth of this has been shown to us lately by the founder of Gateway Church. That is a smear on all Christianity.
And so comment was made, there is some more modern behavior where we're seeing that kind of thing come up, where Christians are being put in a very negative light, which kind of is about to get us to a point. So Peter was saying here essentially that Christians need to glorify God in their behavior. He said that in verse 9, what we looked at last week, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. In other words, our behavior needs to focus on God and not ourselves. And then secondly, our behavior should actually vindicate us of any accusations made against us. If we look a little bit ahead in verse 15, it says, by doing right, you silence the ignorance of foolish people. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this just with some of the comments, but how does negative Christian behavior impact non-believers' view of God? But pushes them away was the comment.
Confirmation in their mind that we're really just like everyone else.
Okay, and it's confirmation in those folks' mind that we're like everyone else in the world. Okay, I kind of think of it like a GPA, a grade point average in college. Okay, you live and die by your GPA in college, right? It's essentially a mathematical representation of how you perform. Now, the thing is with the GPA is you can work and work and work, and you can build that GPA up. You can even max it out, and you can continue to work, and it sits there. You have one bad class, and that GPA tanks. It just takes one. But if you come back and you do well in another class, it doesn't go back to where it was. It creeps up just a little bit. And you have to work harder and harder to get it back just to where it was. And you probably won't ever get it there, to be honest with you. That's how our behavior is viewed. We can take the right steps day to day, but we have one bad day. You lash out at somebody, you can bet they're going to remember that more than they remember the good things, which is unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. Okay. What was the comment?
I hear people say when that happened, well, they're hypocrites. You know, they think you're supposed to be perfect, I guess, because you come to church. That's my experience with people. Y'all are just hypocrites. You say one thing and do another.
So that, yeah, a comment was made is that Christians are typically hypocrites, and that we always say one thing, but we do the other. All right, let's go ahead and move on. We're going to go ahead and talk about our second part. We're going to look at verses 13 to 17. It says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you silence the ignorance of foolish people. Act as a free people, and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." Okay, so as a follow-on to verse 12, Peter is urging submissive behavior. And this directive towards submissiveness is nothing new in the New Testament. In fact, those particular directives have been called household codes, that's kind of hard to say, as well as Christian responsibilities. We see them scattered throughout the New Testament. You see it in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through chapter 6, verse 9, Colossians chapter 3, verse 18 through chapter 4, verse 1, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 18 to 15, then also in Titus chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, and chapter 3, verses 1 to 2. Now, in this particular case, Peter is going to direct he's going to direct submissiveness in three different areas of your life. We're going to talk about two of them this week. The next one we'll talk about next week, or the third one we'll talk about next week. All right, so the first of these is that Christians are to submit to the facets of an orderly society. Okay, he uses the phrase in verse 13, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution." Okay, that literally means to every human creation. What that's saying is all sorts of man-made authority you have to be in submission to. That could be the economic structure. It could be the civic structure. For us, that's essentially municipal government, state government, federal government. We are to be in submission to those entities. Now, in verse 14, he indicates that these authorities are given because they serve to accomplish a structured society. Okay? Look at Romans 13, verse 3. Paul wrote, "For the rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same." In other words, what he's saying is that these governments are established to prevent chaos, right? They are there to punish evil and to praise good, and that's their role. Now, if you look at verse 15, it says, "For such is the will of God, that by doing right you silence the ignorance of foolish people." Okay, he's essentially kind of indicating there that submission to government authority is also expected by God. Now, if we combine that with what Paul said in Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 2, he basically says that authority is established by God, and resistance to that opposes God's ordinance. Okay, it's pretty strong words. We look at Romans 13, verse 2. It says, "Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves." All right, so by kind of leading up, Paul is essentially saying the authority that's above you in these laws, okay, that's set up by God, so you need to ensure you follow those laws. Now, what he's saying, though, is if you do that, the people who are accusing you and slandering you, they will not have a leg to stand on because you're doing what you're told. Okay, and that's what Paul's statement is. Now, he kind of goes and he changes tactic a little bit in verse 16. He goes in and he says, act as a free people and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondservants of God. Okay. So he's kind of taking another approach here and he's going, okay, now I know that you're a free people. What does he mean by that they're free?
In America, it means that we're free to choose the government under which we live because we live under a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Okay, that's true, but that's not the case then. How are these people free?
How does it apply to us today?
Okay, now we're getting to that. How are those people free? Sorry? They're free from sin, yeah. So that's the freedom that he's referring to, and we are as well, right? We're free from sin. When we repented and were baptized, we cut those chains of sin. We don't bear that anymore. But Paul's going, okay, you're free from sin, but that doesn't mean you get to go do all of these behaviors. Okay, you don't want to use that as an excuse. You don't sin in self-service, right? If we look at Romans chapter 6, verses 1 to 2, it says, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? Far from it. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? Okay. What's being said here is, yes, you are free from sin. But in doing that, you have chosen to follow God. And God being essentially moral authority, moral standard, by choosing him, you chose to follow God who is set apart. You yourselves are now set apart, and therefore your behavior should follow God, right? So your freedom comes with service to God through obedience.
And in verse 3 in chapter 13 of Romans, it tells us, it says, do that which is good. Now, if you're following the government, trying to do what the government asks you to do, you still can make choices, as it were. You can do it for good, or you can do it not for good. So we need to still steer ourselves for good.
Yeah, so the comment was made that Romans says that our behavior needs to be good. So the decisions we make when we're following the law need to have the right reasons. We need to do things for the good. Okay, so with that in mind, knowing that we need to follow the authority of the government. And guys, do we have is the screensaver on up there? Let me see if I can power. Sorry, we're locked up. There we go. Oh, okay, we're back. Okay, knowing that, are there times when civil disobedience is acceptable for Christians?
Whenever it goes against the will of God.
Okay. Yes was one answer, and whenever it goes against the will of God. Yeah, we're given a very specific example in the Bible. Look at Acts chapter 5, verses 27 to 29. So Peter and the apostles have been teaching in Jerusalem. They've been told to stop by the religious authorities. So starting in verse 27, it says, when they had brought them, he's talking about Peter and the apostles, they had them stand before the council. The high priest interrogated them, saying, we gave you strict orders not to continue teaching in this name, talking about Jesus, and you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and intend to bring this man's blood upon us. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. Okay. So whenever the authority, whatever that is, gives us direction that it directly opposes what God tells us, then we must follow what God says. Otherwise, whether we like it or not, there may be some rules that we don't like about that come down from the government. If they don't directly oppose what God says, then we're told to follow, which isn't fun sometimes, but unfortunately that's what the hard teaching is. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, looking at verses 18 to 20. It says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are harsh. For this finds favor, if for the sake of conscience towards God a person endures grief when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if, when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God." Okay, so we go from talking about following the authority of human authoritative structures or like government to now a slave-master relationship. Now, I want to say here that although it can be misinterpreted, Peter is not condoning slavery with this text. That's not what's happening here. Okay, slavery was a common part of Greco-Roman society. Okay, it was a major part of the economy, and it was just a part of everyday life to these people. So when Peter's writing this, he's writing it from the perspective of, how do I live with slavery as a Christian as I am directly affected by it? Remember, some of these folks probably were slaves in some sense. So now, with that in mind, we need to kind of look back at slavery at the time. There was some kind of sort of classes of slavery, right? You had house slaves. This was a smaller group of people, and they were typically educated or they were skilled in some sense. And so in that, they could provide some specific service to their owners. So that might be able to educate the children of the owners or provide some other service. Now, the vast majority of slaves, though, were not that way. They were unskilled labor. And in cases of working in mines or in the mill, it was horrible work to the point where the life expectancy of a slave was about 3 to 4 years. Okay. Very hard lives. So make no mistake, Peter's talking about slavery here. Now, what's interesting is in verse 18, he says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect." Okay, he uses the word here, servants. In the Greek, he uses a more mild form of slave. Okay, he uses a harsher form of master. Now, this basically it's different than what Paul does. Paul uses a harsher form for slave, as in bond slave, and a lighter form for master. So I guess the question is, did Peter use these words on purpose? Okay. Could it have been a literary choice? Possibly. I think some think that. Or was there another reason that he used these words? So the question is, why would Peter make a distinction when addressing submission to slaves?
Scripture is God inspired, by His Spirit. His thoughts were led
Okay.
in a direction to make a point.
So a comment was made that Scripture is inspired by God, so what he wrote, he was led to write that way. And so there could be maybe some different reasons. I said it could be purely literary choice. The other thing is it could be his audience. Maybe they tended to more of that kind of house slave role. It could also be that it's hard to talk to someone who has a life expectancy of 3 to 4 years and tell them that they need to be submissive. They probably understand that pretty well. Okay. It's just something to think about in the writing. Now, if we look at verse 18, it says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect." Okay, so servants were to treat their masters with a respect. Okay, now the word here he uses actually fear in the Greek, and it's the same word in noun form as the verb phrase in verse 17 that says to fear God. Okay. So did Peter direct slaves to fear their masters as they did God?
I just think it's this idea of respect and to follow their masters. Paul mentioned this a while ago, is to make sure that what you're doing, the things they are asking you to do, if you don't want to go against God's will, yes, we are to respect this person that's in charge of you, but you need to search your heart and make sure. Like, for example, if your master is asking you to do things like watch the children and all this kind of stuff, but if your master is asking you to, smuggle goods or something,
Okay, so the comment was made, we just need to have proper respect for the owner, but it depends upon what they're asking you to do, whether you choose to do that.
and also back in this day and time, our experience with slavery here in this country, it was a race thing. But back then, it was not. And sometimes it was that way, but sometimes, these people became slaves of their own free will. They were indentured, they became a slave sometimes to pay off a debt because they had no other way to get out of debt, and so it was their choice sometimes to become a slave.
Yeah, so the comment was made, just you have to recall that the culture of slavery was a little different than what we might understand today, right? Yes.
I think it's just an extension, another example of what he's already been talking about being submissive to authority, and your behavior reflects on Christ, and so you need to keep your behavior in accordance with that.
Okay. So the comment was made, it's basically continuing the point that's being made here is you need to be respectful of the authority and make sure that your behavior reflects on God. Yes, sir, do you have a point?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So, following up on that point, nations are raised up and put in position by God. Relationships between people are likewise. So, a master in a home he's got that authority through God. God has allowed him to have that authority. And so, when we go back and think about how our relationship in this world, we need to recognize that we are reflecting Christ to that world around us, whether it's a slave master or a servant. I mean, where we fit in that whole spectrum, or even a government. And I think that we can. In fact, can we go back to that passage, because there was. Okay. So it doesn't have. Okay, so let me rephrase that. When we sin and we get slapped, we recognize where that came from. We are punished for something that we did. But when we are doing what is
Okay.
But that persistent love for him, even when they were suffering unjustly, it has an impact on the world around us. It's not going to have an impact on everybody, but there are those who are little children that are watching, and they see that.
Okay. Try to paraphrase. Okay, so the comment was made, God establishes authority as he sees fit. Okay, and that can be in different ways. Slave-master relationship at that time, government, whatnot. But how we respond to that authority is a reflection of God, which we talked about. But it can have an impact on people, what he's saying. So he mentioned the Christians in the Colosseum, how they took that persecution and essentially that death has a reflection on the people who were watching that. Okay? Now, it's not going to hit everybody the same way, but it does reflect on people. Good enough?
And I think, in reality, the unjust suffering by people of the world, that touches people.
Okay, and so he's saying, today if we see unjust suffering, that tends to have an impact and touch people. Okay, so we look here, Peter goes on to say, despite this helpless position that these slaves were in, that God finds favor, and we've kind of really circled on this quite a bit, but God finds favor when one endures after doing what's right and is unjustly treated. Okay, what he means here is that excellent behavior is expected of all believers, right? It doesn't matter what you are or what position you're in, sin finds no favor with God, right? So even if someone slanders, even under deplorable conditions, slander is still a sin, and God cannot be part of that sin. Or there's a chasm, God's on one side, sin's on the other. He can't be with it. Okay. So even if you're in a horrible situation and you choose to sin purely out of frustration, it's still sin. Okay? And so Peter's telling them, given your knowledge and understanding of God, the fact that he's set apart, the fact that you are now set apart, your behavior needs to reflect that, right? You need to bear up that undue treatment. Hard teaching, again, talking to someone who lives under slavery, that's a very hard teaching. It's probably something very hard to take. All right, let's go ahead and continue. All right, verses 21 to 25. For you have been called for this purpose, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you would follow in his steps. He who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth, and while being abusively insulted, he did not insult in return. While suffering, he did not threaten, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself brought our sins in his body up on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. By his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Okay, so at this point in time, Peter stepped away from his directives towards submissiveness, seemingly driven by the end or his closing in verse 20, right? He wrote, but in verse 20, but when you do what is right and suffer for it patiently, and suffer for it and patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. So it's as if Peter wrote that and goes, oh, you know what? Speaking of people who suffer and patiently endure it, let me tell you about the perfect example that you're to follow with regard to that. And he goes on and writes verse 21, for you have been called for this purpose. Okay, this purpose is referring to, we lost it again, guys. This purpose is in reference to verse 20 and 21. Thank you. And it essentially becomes a culmination of the entire chapter 2 of 1 Peter. Okay? And that is, Peter goes on to explain why Christians often have to suffer as part of submission and meekness. And that's essentially because Christ is our example. Now, he uses a pretty interesting word here for example in verse 21. Okay, the Greek word is hypogrammos. Okay, that is a unique word in the New Testament. It's only used in this one case. And essentially what it is an alphabet tracing pattern for people who are learning to write. Okay, so when you're a child and you're looking up on, you're in school and you look up on the board and you have this series of the alphabet, right? It may be like a banner going up on the top of the wall, maybe on a handout. You use that as you were learning to write. You were trying to match those letters, okay? Peter is calling Christ that pattern. He's saying you're to follow that pattern, you're to mimic that, okay? Now, he goes on in verses 22 to 23 to explain how Christ is that pattern or is that example. And he heavily leans on Isaiah chapter 53 to do that. Now, Isaiah chapter 53 is the description of the promised Messiah. And if you haven't read that, I highly encourage you to, because it's quite profound. Okay. As a side note, it happened to also be the scripture that the Ethiopian eunuch was reading when Philip ran alongside, asked him if he understood it, and he eventually converted the Ethiopian using that text as a starting point. So you can see why this could be used by Peter here. Now, throughout those verses, he goes on and essentially speaks to the direction to keep behavior excellent in the face of slander, right? He says, or in verse 22, it says that he did not return insult for insult. And then in verse 23, he didn't seek retribution for himself. He left all of that to God. And so that's really telling us how we need to handle things, right? How we need to handle slander. Don't seek revenge. Let God handle it. If we're slandered, don't slander in turn. Okay, the last point made here is in verses 24 to 25. And it talks about, before it talked about how Christ is the example, now it's talking about why Christ is the example. And to do that, Peter pointed to the cross as to why he's the example and why we follow him. Now, the reason he gives says he himself brought our sins in his body up on the cross so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. Okay, so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. That is why we follow him. Okay, that is why he is our example. Now, unfortunately, the English here doesn't do justice to really the point Peter's trying to make. He mentions the word cross here. In the Greek, that word is wood or tree. It could even be used for club. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's a little bit of a reference to this in Galatians 3:13. Paul wrote, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, for it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Now, what's being referenced here is an Old Testament, I don't know if it's a law or a custom, for people who have broken a law in an egregious manner, that once they're executed, they were impaled on pikes and put out for display. See what this person did? Don't be like this person. And they hung them on a tree, impaled them, to show everybody else what this person's done. They became a curse. Okay, you see, this is actually talked about in Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 to 23. Now, if a person has committed a sin, carrying a sentence of death, and he is put to death, you hang him on a tree. His body is not to be left overnight on the tree, but you shall certainly bury him on the same day, for he who is hanged is accursed of God. Okay, and we see this actually put into action in Joshua chapter 10, verses 26 to 27, where Joshua put to death 5 kings. He killed them, and they impaled them for everybody else to see. Okay? So what we're seeing here is this is telling us what Christ did for us. He became that curse. He took on all that sin, that egregious sin, and in doing so was hung on a tree and became a curse for us to see. Okay? That's what this is referred to. So it's speaking to the extent of which Christ went to save us from sin. That is why he is our example. Okay, that's all I have for today. We'll cover chapter 3 next week. Thank you.